Welcome back, everyone. As promised, I played my experimental Deadeye build in my previous video. Very importantly, that video was the Draft 1 version of this build. Playing Draft 1 unearthed some rather intriguing performance results. Some were quite unexpected, others were perfectly in line with my predictions. The main takeaway from playing Draft 1 was this build does have potential, but it still underperformed a little bit in that session. Even if I were to factor out the bad match conditions from that night, and my own lack of expertise. On top of that, I made a bad call and played past the point of exhaustion, which also worsened my performance. As I played Draft 1 and took notes, I got the impression that Draft 1 wasn't the strongest version of this build that I could make. But the jury is still out on whether or not Draft 1 would shine in the hands of an experienced player. If I had to guess, Draft 1 probably isn't going to be OP no matter who is playing it. At best, it's only going to be good. Draft 1 was very high strain to play. As of making this video, I also have results for how the Draft 2 version of this build performed inside matches. That session will be up on YouTube soon. I could tell when I'd made it that Draft 2 would be much more forgiving of mistakes and would have been better to start out with. When I played it, I was surprised to find out that Draft 2 is probably better than Draft 1 even in the hands of experienced players. In other words, I don't think what I added to Draft 2 will just be training wheels. But Draft 2 could still be argued to be cheesier than Draft 1 is. Draft 2 is a lot more likely to be OP in the hands of a skilled player than Draft 1 would be. What's also nice is the psychological considerations for playing Draft 2 appear to be optimal so far. Meaning Draft 2 seems to exist in the sweet spot where it is just strong enough to be competitive, but it still requires you to play in a really lively and active way in order to earn that power. Importantly, it doesn't just require you to play like this, it actively incentivizes it too. You are unlikely to encounter issues with scaling laziness, aka tank syndrome, while playing this build. So it should be easier to keep yourself sharp. I'm currently unsure how well a build this fragile would do in a tournament setting. I could see it going either way, but it should be really powerful in settings with randomized teams, where the average player skill is somewhat low. In both sessions, I'll mention there were plenty of matches where I got very tilted, which also detracted from my performance some. To get into the specifics of what I changed between these two drafts, Draft 1 had Be Quick or Be Killed, as well as Blinding Powder, Blade Storm, and Hide in Shadows. Draft 2 has Maleficent 7 on, along with Roll for Initiative, Shadow Meld, and Withdraw. Draft 2 has a lot more initiative and evade frames than Draft 1 does because of these differences. In exchange for losing the ability to stealth my teammates for long periods of time, and having to rely more on casting Black Powder plus Heartseeker to go into stealth myself. I technically didn't lose any on-demand stealths because I put Shadow Meld on. But in practice, Draft 2 will still have a higher reliance on using combos to go into stealth than Draft 1 does. You'll probably want to Black Powder Heartseeker at the beginning of combat to prevent yourself from being targeted as well. The evade frames and launchbacks I added also helps this build significantly. It makes up for only having 2 dodges, and improves its mobility. The extra initiative also improves its mobility. This build didn't really need to be wasting initiative on stealthing my teammates anyways, so losing the extended team stealths wasn't a huge loss. If you did stealth your teammates, you'd need to put it down closer to the middle node at the beginning of the matches, or in the middle of a team fight to get any use out of it. Speaking of stealth, I am noticing that my 1-power auto-attacking may somehow be messing up a lot of my stealths and unnecessarily dragging out my rotations, along with enemy crowd control effects and possibly me taking a lot of damage while stealthed. So I haven't gotten to land very many stealthed attacks so far. This is one of the biggest downsides to this build being melee. I could try checking my options settings to see if I can turn off auto attacks. Another thing I could try is being more careful not to hit one prematurely in case that is it. Backstab is tied to the 1 key though, so you'd think one automatically going off while stealthed would be a good thing. But I'm seeing a lot of weird failed stealth hits and involuntary freezes whenever I'm practically breathing down my target's neck for some reason. I could try stealthing further away and try to cut people off that can't see where I am. That will take some skill to get good at. I also noticed that casting Shadow Shot while stealthed and then quickly casting Backstab sometimes results in a successful stealth hit. Another major downside to this build being melee is it has very limited chase potential, and enemies often run away from your stealth hits. Even Draft 2 has a hard time chasing enemies that flee, but it's able to be persistent enough to pull it off if you chain your stuff well. Equipping a rifle would potentially be an improvement, plus I would gain access to 2 more on-demand stealths from Silent Scope in exchange for losing a small amount of damage per strike. As for how Shortbow did on this build, so far it's a lot better than I was anticipating. I was expecting to barely ever use it, but there were a lot of situations where I should have been using it more and been quicker to make that decision. Likewise, there were also some situations where I lingered on my shortbow for too long when I should have been quicker on switching back to dagger pistol to finish the enemies off. If you wait too long, the enemies can rebound from the brink of death and wipe your whole team. Shortbow damage isn't very focused or secure feeling, it's more spread out, but consistent pressure from shortbow can be a devastating advantage in team fights. I should also be alternating between poison and explosions more than I was, instead of only using one of those for an extended period of time. Anytime I needed to interrupt enemies, I used poison, which worked wonders. Even just spamming the shortbow 1 skill is quite strong and a solid option if you can't afford to lose initiative at all at that moment, or when the enemies have a lot of minions or clones. I'm currently unsure which healing power is a better fit for the Draft 2 version of this build between Hide in Shadows and Withdraw. This could be down to personal preference, but at this time I can't really say for sure. The biggest surprise for how my Draft 1 Deadeye build did inside matches was the lack of use I was able to get out of Be Quick or Be Killed. I was expecting those 2 seconds of quickness and extra stats at the beginning of combat to be very useful against real players, just like it was against the test dummies. But in reality, the players I fought usually did precautionary dodges at the beginning of combat, or found other ways to delay me from hitting them for longer than 2 seconds. And many of these players weren't even trying to avoid me in particular. They probably just do that mindlessly out of habit. As for how this impacts my prediction about this build being the most reaction time centric build I've ever seen, It's still very dependent on reacting fast, but you often won't flatline enemies at the beginning of combat. You'll have to wait for opportune moments to hit them instead. Maleficent 7 also increases how big my hits can get even when it's not fully charged, because it allows you to stack more Malice pips, and each of those increases the damage of your stealth hits. The boons Maleficent 7 grants are also quite useful even if I can't enter stealth right then. I don't hit 7 stacks all the time, but I hit them more often than I was expecting. I definitely end up with more than 5 Malice pips often enough to get good use out of it. Rewatching my test sessions showed me that one of the bigger mistakes I was making was not remembering to press R enough or taking too long to make that decision. R was my mercy cantrip. This Deadeye build also can be very team dependent in order to perform well, something I found out the hard way. Positioning is everything, and if your teammates decide to all scatter and rocket around obstacles at breakneck speed the whole game, they will get you killed, unless you are following their every move meticulously. The longer your team keeps this up for, the more strain they will put on you, and the more likely it is that you will be ganked and killed, or be rendered unable to act for an extended period of time. You want your teammates to bunch together more and try to stay with you so they can utilize your DPS. If they don't do this, then try your hardest to follow them. Ideally, your team will take the fighting to the nodes when possible. When people are on nodes, they tend to run around less than when they are off node, making it easier to avoid getting separated from your teammates. An exception is when your team is working to isolate enemies and pick them off that way. You can definitely help with that. Some of the time you'll need to pop off node to hide behind stuff and recover like anybody else though. Similarly, when you are working together with one ally to cap a side node with an enemy present, you typically are going to want them to bring the bitch to you on the node, instead of your ally holding the enemy out of reach off node while you try to cap alone. An alternative is to decap the node and then go help your teammate off node. As the saying goes, any plan is better than no plan though. So you will need to follow your teammates' lead a lot of the time, even if it's not the best plan. You can still take initiative in some situations and for things like selecting targets, but the main tool you have to move the location of a fight is to end the fight as quickly as possible. If that doesn't work, the onus is on your teammates to move the fight. In most situations, one of the worst things they can do is leave you behind to handle a full cap with a high risk of getting intercepted by enemies. You should try to leave before them and be quick about it. You should also be avoiding 1 versus 1s with duelists like the plague. You can sometimes win a 1 versus 1 on this build, but it's extremely risky. By default, you should be in the process of killing enemies nearly every waking moment on this build, and at least one teammate should be nearby. Fighting and traveling as a trio also works well when possible. When you are running into a fight, try to let your teammates go ahead of you. You usually want to be the one finishing up the kills, not the one starting the fights. If you move in first, you are a lot more likely to be focused by the enemy team. You'll also want to make use of your amazing cleave to quickly finish off downed enemies. If you are in a hurry, which you often will be, you can just drop your shortbow poison on the downed enemy and let your teammate do the rest. If you have a choice between stomping and cleaving a downed enemy on this build, you'll usually want to pick cleave. This build can also cleave quite well even when it is downed. You'll be able to rally yourself in many situations from it. If there are other downed enemies, always aim at the one with the lowest HP if you are downed. Notably, you can also call targets while downed, so you can throw in a little bit of leadership. Also, if you do still have the option of killing downed enemies really slowly if you deem it safe to do so. The longer that enemy is rendered unable to act, the better after all. But on this particular build, you probably won't be doing controlled burns like this very often. Both for your safety and because of how fast you can generate points from getting kills on this build. If you are presented with a choice between rezzing your downed allies and killing a downed enemy, you'll almost always want to pick killing the downed enemy, assuming your teammates are close enough to rally from it. Sometimes you'll need to do a little bit of both, where you need to briefly spend some time restoring some of your downed teammates' HP to prevent their HP from being the first to empty. Then go back to hitting the downed enemies. If none of your teammates are downed, and you are given a choice between hitting a still living enemy and a downed one, usually you should pick the still living enemy. Downed enemies usually don't hurt as much as alive ones. In general, a good response to pressure is to eliminate the source of it as quickly as possible. If the downed enemy happens to be a ranger, then you should get rid of them first. If a downed enemy is really close to getting up, you should immediately lower their health gauge back down to stop it. On another note, if any of you do decide to add a rifle to this Deadeye build, and you want to avoid botching your attack rotations, you should take the initiative to reposition yourself for a clear shot. Don't wait on your teammates or other enemies to move out of the way for you. You do the moving. Another useful tip is to try to hit your target in between their dodges, right after their dodge immunity frame ends and before they dodge a second time. It seems obvious, but that doesn't mean I always kept it in mind. That is everything for now, guys. See you next time. I'll be playing this build more, and will make an update video if these early observations turn out to be inaccurate. Probably I'll be playing a lot of Draft 2, since that is the better version so far.